On the night of the 14th of April, 1912, the richest man aboard the Titanic helped his pregnant young wife into a lifeboat, stepped back onto the tilting deck, and waited to drown. His name was John Jacob Astor IV, and the fortune that made him the wealthiest passenger on the most famous ship in history had not begun with steel or oil or steamships. It had begun more than a century earlier, with a German immigrant who came ashore with a crate of flutes and built the first great American fortune out of three things the family would spend the next 100 years trying to forget: the skins of trapped animals, the opium it smuggled into China against the emperor's law, and the patient ownership of the ground beneath New York. By the time the fourth John Jacob Astor slipped beneath the North Atlantic, his family had decided who counted as society in America, and had housed its poorest citizens in some of the worst slums on the continent. The Astor name he carried onto the Titanic had by then acquired the sheen of permanence. It belonged to Fifth Avenue, to marble ballrooms, to the Waldorf-Astoria rising above the heart of Manhattan, to a list of 400 people who were said to be the whole of polite New York. It was a name that sounded like inheritance. It sounded like something that had always been there, the way the Hudson had always been there, or the granite under the island. Almost none of it had been inherited. The first John Jacob Astor had been born in 1763 in Waldorf, a village in the German Palatinate, the son of a village butcher. He had crossed the Atlantic as a poor man and beaten the dust from furs in a shop of his own in Lower Manhattan with his own hands. Within a single lifetime, he had become the wealthiest man in the United States. Within 3 generations, his descendants had turned the money into something that looked like an aristocracy and behaved like one. The wealth that drowned with the fourth Astor had been assembled from materials no aristocrat would name at dinner. It came from beaver pelts, carried out of the Pacific Northwest, taken in trades that bound and broke the indigenous nations who supplied them. It came from chests of Turkish opium run into the harbor at Canton against the standing law of the Chinese Empire. And it came, above all, from land. From a cold and methodical campaign to buy the farmland of Manhattan while it was still farmland, to wait and to lease the ground out beneath whatever the growing city chose to build upon it. The Astors did not manufacture. They did not invent. They acquired, and they held, and they waited, and the city made them rich simply by rising on top of them. By the time the Titanic sailed, the dynasty had reached the height from which dynasties begin their descent. The grandest of its monuments would be pulled down within a generation. The fortune would scatter among heirs and lawyers. The senior branch of the name would cross the ocean and turn improbably into a British title. The man on the slanting deck in his white tie knew none of this, watching the lifeboat that held his wife drop foot by foot toward the black water below. To understand how he came to be standing there and how the money came to be his, the story has to begin more than 100 years earlier, with a young man stepping off a ship into the new American Republic, carrying everything he owned in a single wooden crate. Most of it was flutes. In November of 1783, a 20-year-old butcher's son boarded a ship at London bound for Baltimore, traveling in steerage with a crate of German flutes to sell and little money to his name. The fortune that would one day put his great-grandson aboard the Titanic began on that crossing, though nothing about the young man in the hold suggested it. The ship reached Chesapeake Bay in January, and then froze fast in the ice for 2 months, unable to dock. During those idle, frozen weeks, John Jacob Astor fell into conversation with a fellow German passenger who had once worked the American fur trade. The man talked, and Astor listened, and by the time the ice broke, he had decided what he would become. He reached New York in March of 1784 and went first to his older brother Henry, a butcher in the Bowery. But the meat trade did not interest him. He took a job instead with an old Quaker furrier named Robert Bone for $2 a week, beating and curing pelts, learning by hand which skins held value and which did not. It was filthy, low work, conducted over whiskey casks of beaver and muskrat stored in cellars. Astor did it well. Within 2 years he had a small shop of his own, selling the flutes his brother shipped from England in one half of the room, and buying furs in the other. And in 1785 he married Sarah Todd, the daughter of the widow who kept his boarding house. Her dowry came to $300, which was enough to widen the business, but her real value was something the ledgers could not hold. Sarah Todd could judge the quality of a fur faster and more accurately than her husband could, and she ran the New York shop whenever he traveled to buy. In time, the work she did became so central that Astor is said to have paid her $500 an hour for her judgment of his furs, a sum she gave away to her church. Late in his life, asked about the architecture of his success, he gave her the credit without hesitation. She was the best partner any man ever had. It was a partnership conducted in the language of profit. The marriage brought Astor a foothold among the established merchant families of New York, the sea captains and shop owners whose connections he would need. The dowry bought inventory, the wife appraised the goods, and romance, if there was any, kept its accounts in order. The business grew through the 1790s, helped along by the Jay Treaty of 1794, which opened the forests of Canada and the Great Lakes to American traders and gave Astor access to far larger supplies of fur. He bought low in the wilderness and sold high in Europe and increasingly in China, where a single shipment of pelts could be exchanged for cargoes of tea and silk worth a great deal more than the furs had cost. He was tireless, frugal, and entirely without sentiment about the work. He spoke in a heavy German accent the New York gentry would mock for decades, and he kept his own books. By the turn of the century, the boy with the crate of flutes had become one of the most successful merchants in the United States. The furs had made him rich. But Astor did not intend to remain one trader among many. He intended to own the trade itself. On April 6, 1808, the New York legislature granted a charter to a new enterprise called the American Fur Company. Its term was 25 years. Its capital stock was set at $1 million, and its sole stockholder, holding every share, was John Jacob Astor. Historians would later call it the first true business monopoly in American history, and that was precisely what Astor intended it to be. The trade he meant to corner did not run on his labor, or on the labor of the clerks in his New York counting house. It ran on the labor of native nations. Across the Great Lakes and up the Missouri River, it was the native nations of the interior, the Ojibwe and the Dakota and many others, who trapped the beaver, dressed the pelts, and carried them to the trading posts, where the American Fur Company's agents met them with European goods, with credit, and with liquor. The credit bound the hunters to the company across whole seasons. The liquor did the rest. There was at the time a federal system designed to prevent exactly this. The government operated its own trading houses, the so-called factory system, built under George Washington in part to shield the tribes from fraud and to keep alcohol out of the exchange. Astor regarded the arrangement as an obstacle to be removed. Working through allies in government, among them Lewis Cass, the governor of Michigan Territory, and Thomas Hart Benton, A senator from Missouri, he secured the abolition of the factory system in 1822. After that, liquor flowed up the Missouri in quantity, and the American Fur Company's Western Department expanded behind it. The numbers traced the rise of a continental machine. By the year 1800, before the company even existed, Astor was already worth $250,000 and stood as the leading figure in the American fur trade. In 1816, Congress barred foreign nationals from trading furs on American soil, stripping his British competitors of their footing below the Great Lakes. In 1822 came the fall of the factory system. By the early 1830s, the company was shipping at least 25,000 buffalo robes a year out of the Great Plains alone, and it had come to control the overwhelming share of the fur trade of the United States, from the Canadian border to the Rocky Mountains. The cost of that machine fell on the country it consumed. The beavers were trapped toward exhaustion across whole watersheds. The hunting economies of the interior nations were folded into a system of debt they could not escape, and the liquor that greased the trade did its slow damage in village after village. Britannica, summarizing his career a century and a half later, would describe the foundation of the fortune in 4 clean words: shrewd dealings with Indian tribes. The phrase covered a great deal of ground. Astor himself never saw most of it. He directed the enterprise from New York, reading reports and signing orders, a merchant who had made himself the silent landlord of an empire of forests he would never walk. When the beavers finally gave out and silk began to replace fur in the hat shops of Europe, he sold the whole apparatus in 1834 to other men and walked away with his profits intact and his hands clean of the ending. But the fur empire had never been the whole of his ambition. Even as he tightened his grip on the Great Lakes, Astor had already reached far past them, toward the mouth of the Columbia River and the Pacific, where he meant to plant a settlement, a port, and a city that would carry his name to the western edge of the continent. Astor's vision for the Pacific was the largest thing he ever attempted. He meant to build a chain of trading posts across the width of the continent, anchored by a great port at the mouth of the Columbia River, that would gather the furs of the West and carry them across the ocean to China. In 1810, he formed the Pacific Fur Company to do it, and he sent 2 expeditions to found the port. One went by land, one went by sea. He himself remained in New York and never went at all. The sea expedition sailed aboard a ship called the Tonquin, 269 tons, which Astor had bought that August and dispatched from New York in September of 1810, bound around Cape Horn for the far coast. He placed her under a former naval officer named Jonathan Thorne, a rigid and short-tempered disciplinarian who held the fur traders aboard in open contempt. It was, as one account later put it, a grave error. When the Tonquin reached the Columbia in March of 1811, Thorne ordered men out in small boats to sound the river's deadly bar in heavy weather. 8 of them drowned before the ship had even anchored. The survivors went ashore and built Fort Astoria, the first American settlement on the Pacific coast and the oldest west of the Rocky Mountains. Then Thorne sailed north to trade and sailed into catastrophe. In June of 1811, at Clayoquot Sound off Vancouver Island, he fell into a dispute over prices with a Tlaoquiot elder named Nukamis, and ended it by rubbing a fur across the old man's face and ordering him from the ship. The next morning the Tlaoquiot returned in numbers, came aboard under the cover of trade, and killed nearly everyone on deck. A single wounded survivor, left below and knowing he would not live, waited until the ship had filled with men come to loot it, and then set fire to the powder magazine. The Tonquin and most of those aboard her, crew and Tlaoquiot alike, were blown apart over the water. One interpreter lived to carry the news back to Astoria. The overland party fared little better, staggering across 2,000 miles of mountain and desert and reaching the post starved and reduced. And then the larger world closed in. When the War of 1812 broke out, the British Navy turned toward the Pacific, and Astor's own managers, fearing capture, sold Fort Astoria and everything in it to the British Northwest Company in 1813 for a fraction of its worth. A Royal Navy sloop arrived afterward and staged a ceremonial capture of a fort the British had already purchased, lowering the American flag, raising the British, and renaming the place Fort George. Astor absorbed the loss from a desk in New York. He had spent a fortune and the lives of dozens of men on a coast he would never cross. He never set foot in Oregon, never saw the Pacific, never walked a single street of the town that carried his name. Astoria was to him a line in a ledger and a wound to his pride, but the dream had always pointed past the fur toward the markets of China. The road to Canton by way of the Pacific was closed now, so Astor opened another. He had found a cargo the Chinese wanted more than pelts, and one that asked no man's permission to sell. Astor had run ships to China for years before he found the cargo that would make those voyages truly pay. As early as 1806, he owned a vessel called the Beaver, some 430 tons and carrying 12 guns, built to take $250,000 in goods around the world to Canton and bring back tea, silk, and porcelain for the American market. The trade was legal, respectable, and only moderately profitable. The Chinese had little use for what America produced and demanded silver in return for their own goods, and silver was scarce. Astor needed something the Chinese would take instead of coin. In 1816 he found it. That year he bought a consignment of Turkish opium at Smyrna in the Ottoman Empire and shipped it to Canton. China had outlawed the opium trade decades before, but the prohibition was enforced from a distance and easily evaded by foreign merchants anchored offshore. The Chinese buyers took the drug readily, in place of the silver they did not wish to spend, and Astor took their tea and silk in exchange. A single such voyage returned more than the fur trade had produced in a season. He had found his commodity, and he expanded into it without hesitation. The figures of the business are worth setting side by side. Astor's China ships had long carried cargoes worth $250,000 apiece. From 1816 onward he poured Turkish opium into those holds, and in the years that followed he sold hundreds of thousands of pounds of it into China. By 1818, American smugglers, with Astor foremost among them, are estimated to have captured roughly 1/3 of the entire Chinese opium market, enough to alarm the British houses that had assumed the trade was theirs. One rival firm in Boston put the matter plainly. "We know of no one but Astor we fear. He did not confine the drug to China. Opium was legal in the United States, sold in apothecaries as medicine, and Astor imported it home as well, advertising it for sale openly in the New York newspapers. The man who would be remembered for ballrooms and grand hotels was, in these years, among the largest dealers in narcotics on the continent, working 2 markets at once. The cost of the trade fell, as it always did, somewhere far from the ledger. The opium that American and British merchants forced into China through the early decades of the century seeded an addiction that spread through the country's ports and cities, and the resentment it bred would erupt, a generation later, in the Opium Wars. Astor was gone from the trade long before the first shot. The British carried the larger share and the larger blame. But the first great American fortune had taken its turn at the work and had profited cleanly. By the middle of the 1820s, Astor had begun to pull his ships home. The China trade was lucrative but uncertain, exposed to pirates, to weather, to the moods of an empire that might at any moment decide to enforce its own laws. He was past 60 now, and he had seen enough of cargoes that could sink, burn, or be seized in a war. He wanted an asset that could do none of those things. He had already been quietly buying it for years. It did not move. It did not spoil. No storm could founder it, and no emperor could outlaw it. It was the ground beneath the city of New York, and Astor intended to own as much of it as a man could hold. Astor had grasped earlier and more completely than almost anyone a simple fact about the city he lived in. New York in his lifetime was a small place crowded onto the southern tip of a long island, but it was growing, and it could grow in only one direction, northward, up the island toward the farms and commons that still lay open above the town. Land that was worthless pasture in one decade would be city blocks in the next. A man who bought ahead of that growth and was willing to wait could hardly fail to become rich. So Astor bought and waited. He rarely built anything himself. His method, refined over decades, was to acquire land, often farmland, beyond the edge of the settled city, to hold it as the streets marched toward it, and to lease it on long terms to others who put up the buildings. The tenants raised the houses and the shops at their own expense. The rents climbed as the city thickened around them, and the ground itself never left Astor's hands. It was an engine that ran on time, and Astor had the patience to let it run. He bought most aggressively when others were ruined. The panic of 1837 threw New York into a collapse that one economist would later compare in severity to the Great Depression. Families lost their homes to foreclosure across the city, and in the middle of the free fall, while property changed hands for a fraction of its worth, Astor spent some $224,000 buying it up. When interest rates climbed afterward and borrowers could no longer meet the mortgages he held, he foreclosed on scores of them without sentiment. The arithmetic of patience could be staggering. In one transaction, Astor took a $25,000 interest in a mortgage on a troubled 22-acre tract called Eden Farm, in the open ground that is now Times Square. When the owner defaulted, Astor foreclosed, carved part of the farm into 141 building lots, and in time those lots sold for something on the order of $5 million. Not all of it was so bloodless. In 1809, Astor bought up the dormant claim of a loyalist family who had fled to England during the Revolution, whose confiscated estate of some 51,000 acres made up nearly a third of Putnam County, north of the city. He paid the heirs about $100,000 for what amounted to a piece of paper. The difficulty was that the state of New York had long since sold that same land to settlers, and more than 700 farms, with several thousand people on them, now stood on ground Astor insisted was legally his. After the last of the old heirs died in 1825, he pressed the claim, and the cases ran all the way to the Supreme Court, which upheld his title. Rather than see thousands of its citizens turned off their farms, the state of New York chose to buy him off, handing Astor roughly $500,000 to surrender a claim that had cost him a fifth of that. He never had to evict a soul. He simply made the public pay him to go away. Late in his life, looking back across all of it, Astor reduced the whole of his career to a single regret, set down by his biographer. He did not wish that he had been kinder, or built more, or given more away. Could I begin life again, knowing what I now know, and had money to invest, I would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan. By the time he died, he had very nearly done it, parcel by parcel, lease by lease, foreclosure by foreclosure. The strategy had made the Astors the greatest private landlords in the city, and the ground rents flowed up to the family in a river that would not stop for 100 years. But as the poor of New York crowded ever more thickly onto Astor land, the river began to carry something besides money. It carried a reputation. The strategy had made the family rich. It was about to make the family hated. John Jacob Astor died on March 29, 1848, in his house in New York, 84 years old. He was the richest man in America, and he had no rival close enough to matter. The size of the fortune is difficult to hold in the mind even now. He left something on the order of $20 million, a sum equal to roughly 1% of the entire economy of the United States, so large that it was said $1 in every 100 in the country had passed through his hands. In the final decade of his life, the rents on his New York land alone had brought him more than $1,250,000 a year, money that arrived whether he worked or slept. Against all of that, his public generosity was thin. He set aside $400,000 to found a free library, the Astor Library, which would one day help form the New York Public Library, and he left a modest sum to the German village he had departed as a boy. The rest, very nearly the whole of it, stayed in the family. The newspapers eulogized him as a self-made marvel, and one magazine pronounced the study of his life instructive. What the eulogies did not dwell on was how little of the city's first great fortune ever flowed back to the city that had produced it. Astor had taken New York's growth and turned it into private rent, and he had given back, against the measure of what he held, almost nothing. He passed over his eldest son, who was unwell and would be cared for in seclusion for the rest of his days, and left the empire to his second son, William Backhouse Astor. William was a heavy, silent, methodical man, well suited to the work of holding what his father had gathered. He did more than hold it. Over the next quarter-century he roughly doubled it, and the city gave him the title his father had worn only unofficially before him. They called him the landlord of New York. It was William who fully grasped what the Astor land was most profitable for. The answer was the tenement. A single block of crowded tenement housing could be made to yield at least twice the rent of a block of decent homes, and so the Astor holdings filled, floor by floor and room by room, with the poorest people in the city. By 1860, the worst of those blocks packed human beings at a density approaching 300,000 per square mile, among the most crowded ground anywhere on earth. The family did not live near them and did not maintain them. The Astors collected. That was the whole of the relationship. In time, the name itself became a kind of verdict. There is a story, often repeated, of a newcomer to the city who mentioned to a health inspector that the building he lived in belonged to Astor. The inspector did not congratulate him. "More's the pity," he said, and moved on. For 3 generations, the men of the family had been collectors. They had collected beaver pelts and chests of opium, blocks of farmland and mortgages in default, and at last the tenants themselves, stacked in the dark to pay the family's rents. But the dynasty's next great figure would not be a man, and would not deal in land at all. She would set out to collect something rarer and far harder to hold. She meant to decide who, in all of America, was permitted to be called society. Caroline Schermerhorn had been born into something the Astors, for all their money, could not buy. The Schermerhorns were old Knickerbocker stock, Dutch landowners who had been prominent in New York when the Astors were still beating furs in a cellar. When she married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., a grandson of the first John Jacob, in 1853, she brought the dynasty the one thing it had always lacked, which was pedigree, and she intended to use it. Her first act was to clean the name. She persuaded her husband to drop his middle name, Backhouse, an old family name that had come to mean, in common speech, an outdoor privy, and she styled herself from then on with a definite article, as though there could be only one. She was the M.R.S. Astor. In a city filling up with railroad money and oil money and steel money, with new millionaires arriving by the season and clamoring to be let in, she appointed herself the keeper of the gate. To work the gate she took on a lieutenant, a Southern gentleman named Ward McAllister, who had appointed himself the arbiter of taste and was glad to make the arrangement formal. McAllister built the machinery of exclusion with real care. He organized 25 men he called the patriarchs, each entitled to bring a fixed number of guests to a series of balls, and through them he controlled, invitation by invitation, who rose and who did not. The wits of the city called him Make-a-Lister, and the name was more accurate than they knew. In 1888 he gave the system its lasting formula. There were, he told a newspaper, only a certain number of people who truly counted. There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society. The figure, it was said, was no accident. It was roughly the number that could fit inside Astor's ballroom. The outer boundary of acceptable America, by this reckoning, was the size of one woman's ballroom on Fifth Avenue, and everyone beyond its walls was no one at all. The mystique survived only as long as it stayed private. In 1892, McAllister handed the actual list of the 400 to the New York Times, which printed it in full. The spell broke at once. The names, once published, could be counted, and the count fell short of 400. McAllister, having shown the machinery to the public, was quietly dropped by the woman he had served, and died a few years afterward, largely forgotten by the society he had helped to invent. The wall he built held only until the new money grew too large to keep out. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt, wife of a railroad heir, announced a costume ball of unprecedented extravagance, and Mrs. Astor's own daughter desperately wished to attend. Alva let it be understood that she could invite no young woman whose mother had never formally called on her, and Mrs. Astor had never called on a Vanderbilt. And so the keeper of the gate climbed into her carriage, drove to the Vanderbilt mansion, and left her calling card. The most exclusive door in America had been opened, in the end, from the outside. Through all of it, Caroline clung to the article in her title. She was not a Mrs. Astor. She was the Mrs. Astor, and to her mind there could be only one. But there was another woman in the family who carried the same name and rejected the claim entirely, and behind her stood a husband with a fortune equal to Caroline's and a grievance he meant to satisfy. The quarrel over who owned a single word was about to split the dynasty down the middle and to raise from the wreckage the most famous hotel on earth. The thing they fought over was a name. William Waldorf-Astoria, who had inherited the fortune of the family's senior branch, held that his wife, and not his aunt Caroline, was the rightful and only Mrs. Astor. Caroline, who had spent 30 years making the title her own, declined to surrender it. There was no court that could settle such a question, so William Waldorf settled it the way an Astor settled things, which was with property. In 1893, he tore down his mansion on Fifth Avenue at 33rd Street, which stood directly beside his aunt's, and in its place he raised a hotel. The Waldorf was 13 stories tall, a tower of commerce and noise and strangers looming over the genteel brownstone next door, and that was precisely the intention. A hotel meant crowds, carriages, deliveries, and the constant traffic of people his aunt would never have received in her parlor, all of it pressed against her windows. He built it to drive her out, and from across the ocean he watched it do exactly that. Caroline held on for a time, and then she surrendered the ground. She moved uptown to a new and larger mansion and left the old house to her son. John Jacob Astor IV was not a man to accept a defeat in silence. He razed his mother's abandoned home and built, on the very spot, a second and taller hotel beside the first. The Astoria opened in 1897, 16 stories to the Waldorf's 13, and the War of the Cousins now stood finished in stone. What blood could not reconcile, money did. The two hotels were joined into a single enterprise, the Waldorf-Astoria, linked by a long marble corridor that filled each evening with the city's wealthy come to see and be seen, and was christened Peacock Alley. But the truce carried a condition. By agreement, the corridor could be walled shut, and the two hotels divided again, should the family quarrel ever resume. The joined name was even set down for a time with an equals sign between the halves, the sign standing for the corridor itself, a punctuation mark commemorating a ceasefire. The scale of the thing was without precedent. The Waldorf rose 13 stories with 450 guest rooms, a private bathroom in every one of them, and electric light throughout, comforts the traveling public had never been offered before. The Astoria added 16 stories and 550 rooms more. Together, the two held some 1,300 guest rooms and 40 public ones, which made the Waldorf-Astoria the largest hotel on Earth, and Peacock Alley ran 300 feet of marble through the middle of it. All of it stood on the cleared rubble of two Astor mansions pulled down by their own family. There was an irony in it the age did not pause to notice. The dynasty that had ruled society by deciding who might enter a private ballroom now sold the experience of grandeur by the night to anyone who could pay the bill. The houses built to keep people out had become a palace built to let them in. William Waldorf did not remain to enjoy his victory. Having raised his monument of spite and driven his aunt from her home, he turned his back on the country that had made his family rich. "America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live," he declared, and he sailed for England to become something no Astor had ever been. In England, William Waldorf Astor set about buying the thing he believed America had denied him. He became a British subject in 1899. He purchased Cliveden, a great estate above the River Thames, and then Hever Castle in Kent, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, which he restored at staggering expense into a medieval fantasy with a mock Tudor village built beside it. And in time, the Crown gave him what no amount of New York real estate ever could. It gave him a title. He was made first Baron Astor and then Viscount Astor, a peer of the realm. The great-grandson of a German village butcher had become an English lord. The English life was paid for by American misery, drawn across the ocean by mail. William Waldorf kept his New York property, the same blocks of aging tenements the family had been collecting for 3 generations, and he took an enormous income from them while he lived in his castles 3,000 miles away. In 1906, the writer H.G. Wells described the arrangement with open contempt. The absentee landlord, he wrote, drew his gold from the city's slums as effectually as a ferret draws blood from a rabbit, something on the order of $6 million a year, sweated out of decaying buildings he never had to look at. The man who had announced that America was no fit place for a gentleman remained, to the end of his days, a New York slumlord. Only his address had changed. He grew stranger as he aged, reclusive and suspicious, buying up London newspapers and brooding behind the walls of his estates. When he died in 1919, he died a Viscount and an Englishman, about as far from the fur sellers of Lower Manhattan as a man could travel in the course of a single life. And the transformation produced a final irony the first John Jacob could never have imagined. William Waldorf gave Cliveden to his son Waldorf and to his son's wife, an American-born woman from Virginia named Nancy. In 1919, the same year the old Viscount died, Nancy Astor was elected to the British House of Commons and took her seat as the first woman ever to sit in that chamber. Under the Astors, Cliveden itself would become one of the most powerful political houses in England. The fortune that had begun with beaver pelts and chests of smuggled opium now wore a coronet and held a seat in Parliament. That was the fate of the senior branch. Gone English, gone respectable, its origins safely buried beneath 3,000 miles of ocean and a noble title. But the American fortune, the Astoria and the New York land, and the living heart of the dynasty had stayed in the hands of the junior branch, and of one man in particular. While his cousin played at being an English lord, John Jacob Astor IV remained in New York, where he was about to make himself the most talked-about man in the country, first through a marriage that scandalized society, and then through a death the whole world would mourn. John Jacob Astor IV was not like the silent money-counting men who had come before him in the family. He was restless, inventive, and fond of attention, a Gilded Age celebrity who seemed determined to be interesting. He held patents on a bicycle brake, a machine for making gas from peat moss, and a pneumatic device for cleaning the dirt from roads, which won a prize at the Chicago World's Fair. He helped develop a marine turbine engine. He was, by the testimony of those who knew him, a genuinely capable inventor, which was an unusual thing for a man who never had to earn a cent. He also wrote a book. In 1894, he published a novel of the future called A Journey in Other Worlds, a romance of the future, in which he imagined space travel to Jupiter and Saturn, and a coming century remade by machines that did not yet exist. It was the work of a man fascinated by what lay ahead, by all the years he was so certain were coming. He would, in the end, be granted very few of them. His public life grew larger still. He built the Astoria, and then in 1904 he raised the St. Regis, for a time the tallest hotel in the world. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, he equipped a military unit at his own expense, lent his yacht to the Navy, and accepted a commission as a lieutenant colonel, though he saw little of any fighting. The rank stayed with him afterward as a kind of ornament. For the rest of his life, the newspapers called him Colonel Astor. And then he did the two things polite New York could not forgive. In 1909, after 18 years of marriage, his wife divorced him, and in their world a divorce alone was a quiet catastrophe. He compounded it beyond repair 2 years later. At the age of 47, Colonel Astor announced that he would marry again, and his chosen bride was a girl of 18 named Madeline Force, a year younger than his own son. Several clergymen refused outright to perform the ceremony. It was held at last in his late mother's ballroom at the family's Newport house, before a society that had come, in many cases, only to disapprove. The disapproval did not fade. The couple were whispered about in every drawing room in the city. And so they did what wealthy people in disgrace have always done. They left. They set out on a long honeymoon through Europe and Egypt, traveling part of the way in the company of a brash Colorado mining heiress named Margaret Brown, whom society would not seat at its tables either. They meant to stay abroad until the scandal at home had cooled and the gossip had found some fresher target. It would have worked in time. But Madeline became pregnant during the trip, and the Astors decided their child must be born in America, as an Astor should be. So they cut the journey short and booked their passage home, choosing for the crossing the newest, largest, and most celebrated vessel afloat, a ship on her maiden voyage that the world had been assured was as near to unsinkable as human hands could make her. Her name was the Titanic. The Astors came aboard at Cherbourg on the evening of the 10th of April, 1912, with a manservant, a maid, a private nurse, and Colonel Astor's Airedale Terrier, a dog named Kitty. They were among the most famous passengers on a ship full of famous passengers. The wealthiest names in America gathered into the first-class staterooms of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. The couple who had crossed an ocean to escape the public eye were going home on the most watched vessel in the world. For 4 days, the crossing was everything the White Star Line had promised. Then, at 20 minutes before midnight on the 14th of April, in calm black water far out in the North Atlantic, the Titanic struck an iceberg along her starboard side. The blow seemed slight to most of those aboard. Few of them understood in the first hour that the ship beneath them had already taken her death wound, and that there were lifeboats enough for barely half the souls she carried, and that far fewer than half would reach them. Colonel Astor understood soon enough. He helped Madeline dress warmly, brought her up to the boat deck, and saw her toward Lifeboat 4. She was 5 months pregnant, and Astor asked the officer in charge whether he might be allowed into the boat to accompany her, given her condition. The officer refused. The rule was women and children, and Astor, to his credit, did not argue it. He handed his young wife over the rail and into the boat, and then he stepped back onto the deck to wait with the men. What he said to her in those last moments has come down only in fragments, none of them certain. By one account, he told her simply that the sea was calm and that she would be safe, that he would find another boat and see her later. The sea is calm. You will be all right. The falls ran out, and Lifeboat 4 descended the black side of the ship toward the water 60 feet below, and Madeline Astor looked up at her husband standing at the rail, growing smaller above her, and that was the last she ever saw of him. In the time that remained, he was seen moving about the deck with an odd composure. He was said to have gone down to the kennels and let the dogs loose, so that whatever became of the men, the animals at least would not drown in cages. At 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, the Titanic broke apart and went down by the bow, and John Jacob Astor IV went down with her, somewhere in the dark, among 1,500 others. The figures of that night have a terrible plainness. Of the roughly 2,200 people aboard, only some 700 reached the boats. Around 1,500 did not. The richest man on the ship died the same death as the poorest emigrant in steerage, and the fortune he left behind, when the lawyers had finished counting it, was appraised at more than $85 million. His body was recovered a week later by a cable ship sent out from Halifax to gather the dead, the Mackay Bennett, and was logged as body number 124. They knew him by the initials stitched into the label of his jacket. In his pockets were a gold watch and a thick roll of money, neither of which had been of the slightest use to him. The watch went to his elder son, Vincent, who was 20 years old, and who would wear it for the rest of his life. The child, Madeline, was born that August, and named for his father, the last John Jacob Astor, born already into a story that had ended before he drew his first breath. The disaster took the man, but it did not touch the money. The fortune passed down whole, untroubled by the freezing water that had closed over its owner. But something else had gone into the sea with Colonel Astor that night, though it would take the rest of the century to see clearly what it was. The money survived the wreck. The dynasty would not survive the century. The fortune came to rest, in the spring of 1912, in the hands of a 20-year-old. Vincent Astor, the elder son, inherited the great bulk of the $85 million and overnight became one of the wealthiest men in America, while his half-brother, the child born that summer, received a trust of $3 million and a name that would follow him through a difficult life. Vincent turned out to be a different kind of Astor. He had never been at ease with the source of the family money, and in the years after his father's death, he began to do what no Astor before him had done. He sold off the worst of it. He disposed of great blocks of the old tenement holdings, the crowded and profitable misery the family had been collecting since before the Civil War, and he turned the proceeds toward other things, some of them charitable. The man who inherited the slumlord's fortune spent part of his life trying to be rid of the part that was slum. It was the beginning of a long unwinding. The family that had been the most powerful in New York for the better part of a century began, after 1912, to thin and to scatter. Vincent died in 1959 without children of his own, and the family's reign over the city, which had lasted more than 100 years, was effectively finished. The name went on, attached to a hotel and a library and a square, but the power behind it was gone. The Astors had stopped being a force in the life of the country and become, instead, a piece of its memory. The clearest proof of it stands on a single patch of ground in Midtown Manhattan at Fifth Avenue near 34th Street. On that spot, once, stood the two Astor mansions whose owners could not abide one another. The mansions were pulled down to build the two Spite hotels. The hotels were joined into the Waldorf-Astoria, the largest and grandest in the world. And in 1929, the Waldorf-Astoria, in its turn, was pulled down, and on the cleared ground there rose the Empire State Building, the entire battlefield of the Astor War, the rival houses, the ballroom that had defined the 400, the palace born of the feud, all of it vanished beneath the foundations of a single skyscraper. The hotel's name was carried uptown to Park Avenue, where it survives today as a label on a building the family no longer owns. There is a lesson buried in that ground, though the Astors are not around to hear it. The first John Jacob had believed that land was the one thing a man could truly keep, the one possession that could not sink in a storm, or burn in a fire, or be seized in a war, or be outlawed by an emperor. He had wished, he once said, that he could buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan. And in this much he was right. The furs gave out. The opium trade closed. The society he had bought his way into collapsed into the century that followed. His most famous descendant drowned in the North Atlantic, and the dynasty itself thinned away to a name on a hotel door. But the land endured. It simply endured for other people. The ground the family had taken such pains to own went on existing after the Astors were finished with it, indifferent to who held the deed, remembering nothing, owing nothing, the way the ground always does. The first Astor came ashore with a crate of flutes and a head full of plans, and built, out of furs and opium and patient ruin, the first great fortune in American history. The last thing his money bought was a place in the story of the most famous shipwreck in the world. Between the two lay well over a century, an empire of land, and the long, quiet truth that no one, in the end, owns the ground for very long. The rise and ruin of America's great dynasties, the fortunes raised on land and blood and patient ruin and then brought low, is the subject of this channel. Please like and subscribe. There are more of these stories here, and more still to come.